Welcome to the Carnivore Cast, a podcast by carnivores for carnivores focused on the carnivore diet and lifestyle. I'm your host, Scott Myslinski. This episode is going to be a little bit different than my typical interviews with the guests. If you couldn't already tell, this is a takeaways episode from my trip to the first ever Boulder Carnivore Conference, the first annual Carnivore Conference held by Amber O'Hearn. And I want to start by saying that Amber O'Hearn, if you didn't already know this, is incredible. She did such a good job organizing this event, making it feel like a home and making it feel like a connected community for the 260 guests, while having a professional, back-to-back academic agenda with great speakers that ran smoothly, and she fed all of us delicious barbecue from the local butcher. So I'm going to keep saying it throughout this episode, but Amber was outstanding at pulling this off. She's never organized a conference before, and this ran super smoothly. I've been to several conferences, and none have been as without hiccups and as well run as this. So I'm really looking forward to future events and conferences run by her. So just to give a little bit of context on what this was held in Boulder, Colorado in the States. It was about 260 folks. I think Amber had originally planned for it to be 100 or less, so she had to upgrade the venue at least once. And there was also a wait list of people trying to get in, so this more than sold out. And it was a full one-day event from about 7 o'clock in the morning, the doors open, till a little bit past 5 p.m., back-to-back with speakers, about an hour, a little bit more break for lunch, and about an hour at the beginning from 7 to 8 a.m. For folks to gather and meet each other, which was really nice too. So I'm just going to go through sort of the schedule of the day, each of the talks, what I took away from each of them, and each of the speakers, and then have some overall thoughts at the end about how I thought the event went and some things I liked about it. So just to start, right off the bat, I thought the sort of organization of speakers in terms of the order and the schedule was great. We started with Makayla Petersen. Lots of folks have heard her story, but she's the daughter and manager of Jordan Peterson, the famous author with 12 Rules for Life, and who's very famous on YouTube for his videos about sort of self-improvement and integrity and values. And she has overcome a whole list of autoimmune conditions, including arthritis, depression, and severe skin problems, all using a carnivore diet. And she's talked about it on Joe Rogan and really been touted by some as the queen of carnivore. And she's a great spokeswoman in this community, and she's very charming as well. So her talk was mostly centered around her story, but she talked about, general themes with not being accepted by doctors and doctors not understanding that things can be caused by diet, and her investigating her own health and then bringing that success to the rest of her family, to her father, to her mother, and giving some general tips on the end, which I thought were really interesting, about how the more severe your autoimmune condition, the more strict you may have to be. You may have to even watch out for spices. And she gave a great example of she was out to dinner in Florida with her family, and she was very specific with the waiter, scrub the grill clean, make sure no spices, no salicylates, no oils, nothing on the steak. And it turned out that they hadn't scrubbed the grill properly, and she had a major outbreak, and a lot of her symptoms of immobility and pain returned. And so she was just extremely inspiring, and really amazing for her to share her story and some of the extreme pain she's gone through, and how much carnivore has helped her, and how important she thinks it is to share stories. And it was just a really inspiring and great way to start the day. Then we dove straight from that into Dr. Zofia Clemmons, who is one of the head doctors at the clinic in Hungary, formerly known as Paleo Medicina. And there they use a paleo ketogenic diet, which is very similar to a carnivore diet, but more specific. Carnivore diet, at least how I define it and a lot of my guests would define it, is you just eat a lot of meat. You don't worry too much about protein to fat macros. You try to get plenty of fat. You eat when you're hungry, eat till you're full. Some people include things like dairy. Some people include things like coffee, and you should spice your food. But in general, that's what you eat. And sometimes you might include organ meats. The paleo ketogenic diet is a diet that they've used in this clinic with great success across Crohn's patients, patients with cancer, ulcerative colitis, PCOS, all types of conditions, and they've published case studies, which are really powerful. But their diet is 2 grams of fat per gram of protein. So it's actually, you eat a small quantity of food, but you add tons of animal fat to it. So you're usually eating, say for an average male, maybe 1 pound of meat a day, but with a lot of extra tallow or lard on it. And they also have a certain amount of organ meats they recommend you eat. And then for their patients who are in remission, they don't suggest, but they allow up to a certain amount of plant matter. I think it's like 30% or something like that from non-starchy vegetables. They also highly discourage any dairy or any coffee. So, all that being said, Zofia Clemmons gave a great talk about intestinal permeability in autoimmune diseases and cancer. And she specifically talked about this test they use for intestinal permeability. She talked about the trade-offs between other tests, but they think the best test is the PEG 400, which is sort of this universally accepted great test to measure intestinal permeability. What's intestinal permeability? From what I understand, it's essentially how much leaky gut you have, or how much food isn't being absorbed in your body, and that can lead to a whole host of conditions like the ones I mentioned, Crohn's, IBS, cancer, etc. And so they measure their patients' PEG 400, the marker of intestinal permeability, before and after they put them on the diet. And so she showed data comparing, normal healthy people to people with these conditions, and just across the board, their PEG 400 is out of range. It's not right. They're not having proper intestinal permeability if you have cancer, Crohn's, even depression, etc. And so they showed how effective, even in a matter of days in some cases, but usually over months, the paleo ketogenic diet can bring people into a state of not only remission from their symptoms, but it correlates directly with intestinal permeability and this PEG 400 score. So I thought that was super interesting. And then on one slide, she even showed the difference in the PEG 400 score between someone on a pure carnivore diet, like the one I described and the one I practice, versus their specialized paleo ketogenic diet. And the PEG 400 was nearly identical. So even though they're recommending for their patients and they practice this very specific diet, it would appear that a lot of the intestinal permeability benefits, at least measured by this test, can be achieved by a traditional carnivore diet. So that was a really interesting one. From there, the next speaker was Dr. Paul Mason. Dr. Paul Mason is someone I'd love to have on the show and hope to in the near future. He's a doctor from, I believe, Australia, and he's spoken multiple times at Low Carb Down Under and on other podcasts, the HPO podcast, many others. He talks a lot about the problems with fiber and the gut. And in his talk, he continued on this. The talk was titled From Lupus to Diabetes, How Your Diet Can Impact Autoimmune Diseases. And he got into really interesting tests around fecal caloprectin and fiber and how these things can negatively impact autoimmune diseases and autoimmune conditions. His talk was very buttoned up, well organized, really interesting. And all of these talks, I should have mentioned at the beginning, will be available online on YouTube. So I'd highly recommend you go check them out. But his in particular was just really gripping, and it was a nice story that sort of built with each of the specific points about gut health and fiber and all those things. So great talk by Dr. Paul Mason. The next talk was by George Diggs. George Diggs gave an interesting talk about plant defense chemicals and how they impact our health. He's a professor at, I want to say, Texas College or Austin College. And he has a background in insects and chemical defenses. So he talked about different types of chemical defenses, toxins, which target the eater, digestibility reducers, which make foods less digestible and not worth eating, and then hormone disruptors. Those are the main ones he focused on. And one of the really interesting points he made is that a lot of plants have developed these chemical defenses, like oxalates, salicylates, etc., to defend against insects and small rodents. But because of our biological, as humans, similarities to insects and rodents, we also suffer from those defenses. So it's not that we humans were eating all these plants and then plants evolved to defend against us. It's more they're defending against rodents and insects. Small nuance, but I thought it was really interesting. It also just made me even more convinced about the dangers of plants in a lot of cases. And he talked about, things like red beans and how they're highly toxic, and certain compounds in coffee and things like that. So that was really interesting, and it actually motivated me to switch to using caffeine pills rather than coffee. So that was a takeaway. Next talk, I love this talk. Miki Bendure spoke about protein consumption throughout history and how it relates to what we eat today. And so his talk was how much protein, the evolutionary answer. So he basically took approach of looking at studies that indicate a physiological limit of protein, and then he looked at protein consumption during human evolution, and then made inferences about what the max protein we could probably safely consume is. So one of the graphs he showed was this really interesting study where the authors tried to essentially look at max protein consumption as a function of nitrogen in urine. So basically, when you eat a ton of protein, the nitrogen in your urine goes up. You're always excreting some nitrogen in your urine, but it goes up to a certain level that they determine is sort of a healthy limit when you eat a ton of protein. And I think for me, as a 170-pound male, it was something like 270 or 280 grams of protein. And they looked at, where did, of all the people in the study, where did the people with the bottom amount of protein, where did people start to get the urea nitrogen? Where was the average person hitting that urea nitrogen level? And then where was the last person to hit that urea nitrogen level? So there was a pretty big range. There were some people, like for my weight, there were some people who hit it at like 250 grams of protein a day, and there were others who hit it at like 300 or 320 grams of protein a day. So it's highly individual. Also, this study did not control for diet type. These people are probably eating a regular carb-based diet, didn't control for protein quality. They were supplementing with a ton of protein shakes. So, I'm highly skeptical of whether this has any practical implications for how much protein we should consume. But the other perspective he gave, which I thought was really interesting, is sort of this protein optimization curve he's come up with, where the more amount of calories you're getting from animal foods, the more fatty those animal foods have to be to make it sustainable. So if you take one extreme where you're eating a ton of plants, those plants will have fat and carbs. So the animal foods you consume can be more like chicken breast and fish if you're getting a lot of avocado and nuts and tubers and starches, because your body can get sufficient energy from those foods without having as much protein. That's not optimal, obviously, for a lot of reasons, but that's in evolutionary terms, you would need both the energy and the protein. Now, if you're consuming very little plants, getting all your energy from animals, those animals need to be fattier. So I think this makes intuitive sense, and the data he presented made a lot of sense. All I took away is I'm going to be a little bit more conscious about adding fat to my meals and lowering my intake. So maybe rather than eating 3 pounds of super lean beef a day, which is what I've been doing, 90-10 ground beef, I'm going to scale it back to 2 pounds a day and adding more fat. See how I feel, see how I do with that. And maybe it'll help. Next talk was Amber O'Hearn. So not only did she put together this amazing conference that ran like a clock, so smoothly, she put together one of the best talks, if not the best talk of the day, where she talked about rethinking recommended daily allowances, RDAs. And this sounds like a talk that you've heard about before. The RDAs may not apply to carnivores. If you're consuming more carbohydrate, you don't absorb nutrients as well. But that was not all she spoke about. She spoke about all these different problems with the RDAs, even the way they're phrased as recommended and allowances. It has this very patronistic feel. But she systematically went through like 7 errors with logical errors with RDAs. And she used examples of really interesting studies across all different types of nutrients. And it was just a beautiful story, great examples, and really interesting messages. I definitely recommend people try to rewatch this one when it comes out. One of the practical takeaways for me was focus on a ketogenic diet, even without adding in fish, had way higher blood levels of omega-3s and folate than people on a standard American diet. So, consuming a lot of, I still am going to consume fish, but I'm very hesitant to take in cod liver oil or anything that would artificially raise my intake of nutrients, given that, she has shown time and time again, our blood levels of these nutrients are higher when we're on a ketogenic diet and we don't have, things in our internal environment impairing our uptake of these nutrients. So nutrient needs are very contextual and interdependent. And she also talked about the fact that just like the RDAs were designed for people in the top Z-score to not be deficient, whereas most people fall in the middle of the bell curve, and really the RDAs are way too much and overcompensating for the fact that people could have a deficiency, which we don't even know is bad. So a lot of the evidence is really poor. The next session was a Q&A session with the speakers from the morning, which was great. A ton of people lined up, asked great questions. Hopefully that'll be on YouTube as well. Then there was a long break for lunch. The lunch was insanely good. I got to sit down and talk with, some fans of the podcast, close friends like Doug Wright, Michael Goldstein, Travis Statham, Zach Moore, Lisa Bailey. Had some great long conversations with them and others. And man, it was just so great meeting people and connecting with fellow carnivores at this conference and feeling at home and feeling welcome and instantly just feeling this nice, warm connection with everyone I met and talked with. And the lunch was a great chance to do that. I really hope that next year they make this a multi-day event and there's more opportunities to do this type of networking and close connecting with people. And the lunch was catered, obviously, in the theater. They had this specialty butchery that Amber is closely connected to. They had beef ribs, which were delicious, as always. Not a lot of meat on them, but it was totally fine. It was all you can eat. Eggs cooked, especially in lard, because a lot of people have food sensitivities. Bacon, and this pork dish. I'm struggling to remember the name of it, but it was delicious. I think it was porchetta, rotisserie porchetta. It was so delicious. And then obviously some nice salt to top that all off. So had a great meal, had a great lunch, beautiful day in Boulder. Then the afternoon sessions, and I'll try to go through these a little bit quicker. Peter Ballerstadt, love him as always. Had a great episode with him on the podcast. He talked about reading environmental hoofprints, speaking about ruminant agriculture and feeding the masses, the global protein supply, how animals are a crucial part of that, converting non-edible foodstuffs to edible foodstuffs, not having the type of environmental impact that a lot of people talk about, and that being overstated, and problems with things like the FAO report, which was redacted but still being cited. So great talk by Peter. He absolutely nailed it, really entertained the crowd, and always great to hear from him. Then was Nick Mailer. Nick Mailer, he comes from a philosophy background, and he gave a really interesting narrative, no slides, speech about the tragedy of the empathetic carnivore. And it was essentially, a lot of it went over my head, I'll be honest, but he was awesome. He basically presented the case that vegans have ethically and why there may be problems with it and how we can think about being ethical as carnivores. So again, one where I would love to speak to Nick again, get him on the podcast, but he's just a really, really intelligent guy and really great talk, which was super relevant for carnivores and for this conference and a lot different than the rest. So I really appreciated that. Then we had Dr. George Eid. I've been trying to get her on the show since day one of the podcast, over 6 months now. She's awesome. She's so smart, and she's inspired me to start Carnivore. She talked about how there are mental health benefits of carnivore. And I love how she framed it as mental health benefits of carnivore, not, mental illnesses tied to plants or how diet affects mental health. She was really tailoring it for the carnivore audience, which was awesome. And she talked about root causes being deficiencies, toxicity, and metabolic mayhem. And she even showed specific pathways that are proposed to work fine in vegans for mental health, but really don't, and where there's insufficiencies in pathways. And I thought it was just a super interesting talk. And I really enjoyed how she sort of framed all the necessary parts of meat and how meat can really positively impact diet. Next was Shaun Baker. Everyone loves Dr. Shaun Baker. I got to meet him in person, shook his hand. I was having the time of my life. I introduced myself. I think at first he was like, Scott? And then I was like, Carnivore Cast. And he's like, oh, I love what you're doing. And I was like, just following in your footsteps, man. But that was a big moment for me. Really fun. And then he gave a really funny talk on the plural of anecdote is data and lessons from his N equals many study. Many people are familiar with the N equals many study. It basically started on the first World Carnivore Month, which was January 2018, I believe, where they got a ton of people to sign up. I did it for a while for 90 days of carnivore and record all these metrics on a app that he admitted was extremely clunky and hard to use. You could record everything from hours of sleep, time you ate, energy, erection strength in the morning, hunger, blood pressure, weight, just all these metrics. And basically a lot of people probably couldn't comply, but he talked about how nutritional research is just a terrible form of science, and he picked apart, epidemiology, all the different types of studies, and he said, it's getting to the point where anecdotes are really powerful, and particularly gathering sort of citizen science in this way can be really strong. So he admitted that, this wasn't a controlled study, that it wasn't IRB approved, that he's not an official researcher. Very humble of him, but he showed some super interesting data on, how all types of people improved on the N equals many study, better sleep quality, lowered their joint pain, improved their mood, improved their gut health, and shared how through that Meat Heals, he's really trying to highlight these stories. And he said, this is how people change their mind. This is how they learn. So that was great. Then there were just two more talks, Dave Feldman and Siobhan Huggins. Siobhan I've had on the show, and Dave was great too. Dave undertook a carnivore experiment, and he basically showed how a carnivore diet meets all of our amino acid needs. He's played with foods and food combinations in all these different ways, everything from oatmeal to vegetables to all these things to try to meet all the amino acid needs on Chronometer, and he magically fell into how carnivore diet just fills all of them easily. And he said, with his experience on the carnivore diet, he was more full. He had great energy. He lost weight right away. He had some other observations, and he said his only complaint was it was a little bit socially weird, which I'm sure we all know. And he said it makes him lazy because it's so easy to do well and fulfill your nutrient needs. Great talk, really entertaining, some great analogies in there with DNA and RNA and all these types of things. Really funny talk and love Dave. And Siobhan closed out the day. She gave an amazing talk on an N=1 field guide, how her N=1 experience of citizen science and using anecdotes to recognize patterns, not only through her deep work in cholesterol science, which is extremely powerful, but also patterns with carnivore and things like that, can just be really good for developing hypotheses, finding patterns, quickly iterating on science and mechanisms. So that was a great talk to close out the day. I was super inspired by her and all the speakers throughout the day. And then lastly, we had a Q&A session with the afternoon speakers and some closing remarks by Amber. But again, I loved this conference. I'm going next year no matter what, hands down. It was so fun. Even just meeting people. Boulder is a beautiful city, tons of great carnivore food, and it was just, I left super inspired, wanting to get all of them on the podcast, wanting to spend a lot more time producing episodes and expanding my reach, talking to other podcasters there, and, keep an eye out because there's going to be some changes to the podcast in the next few months. And I hope you're there for the journey with me, and hope you enjoyed this episode. For all resources and show notes and things like that, go to carnivorecast.com. You can also find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook if you just search Carnivore Cast, and feel free to shoot me an email. It's info@carnivorecast.com. Look forward to hearing from you, and thanks so much for listening. Keep it carnivore.